Sympathy has often been described as winged charity. I like that. Sympathy is the nurse for the illness of the soul. It is the feeling of compassion for another's suffering. Believe me, if ever you have suffered internally, anxiety or loneliness, and you have spoken to someone who simply listens to you, then you know what I'm talking about. Sympathy is something spontaneous. Just as charity is in the heart, so sympathy is nothing more than winged charity, a gift coming from the heart to another. In the Gospel from St. Matthew, which I have just read, we hear Jesus describing pretty vividly what a lack of sympathy looks like. By hearing you shall not hear and not understand, and seeing you shall not see and not perceive. For the heart of this people is grown gross. In other words, the heart that is gross is dull in feeling. Instead of being sensitive, the gross heart is callous. Instead of being prophetic, it is blind. Such a heart is not winged charity. It is tied to itself and caged within the narrow confines of selfishness. To have a sympathetic heart, you need three qualities. Number one, unselfishness. 2, knowledge. 3, experience. Unselfishness, knowledge, experience. Unselfishness is the uncharitable heart that looks outside of oneself. Besides being unselfish, sympathy calls for knowledge. We must know another person's sorrow, hold another person's pain in order to feel for him or her. And finally, the richest sympathy is produced by knowledge, vivified by experience, and no one is more sympathetic than someone who has known what it feels like to hunger for sympathy, and then desires to save others from drinking the cup which they themselves have drunk deeply from. We see these three qualities of sympathy, unselfishness, knowledge, and experience, beautifully represented in the hearts of Jesus and Mary. Since the heart of Jesus was God's gift to us, it is an utterly unselfish gift. It was made for others. John tells us so beautifully, God so loved the world that he sent us his only Son. As for knowledge and experience, the gospel writers tell us Jesus read the hearts of all. He knew their thoughts. He knew what was in them. Jesus is the searcher of the heart. He is the man of sorrows. The life story of Jesus as found in the Gospels is the story of a heart of sympathy. Matthew tells us, and seeing the multitude, he had compassion on them because they were distressed and lying like sheep without a shepherd. St. Paul reminds us, as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so also Christ does our comfort abound. Sympathy is also an outstanding virtue of our Blessed Mother. Her sympathetic heart went out to the young married couple and to their relatives at the wedding feast of Cana. Her heart was filled with sympathy for her crucified Son as she stood on Calvary's hill. In the days that followed, all the disciples in the upper room experienced her loving sympathy. Where people show themselves to be children of Mary, she shows herself to be their mother. We need to model our hearts, fashion our hearts after the hearts of Jesus and Mary. And sympathy has the wonderful power to change great sinners into devoted and self-sacrificing saints. There are times, more than we realize, where we are not inclined to help those who have fallen. I remember years ago, my sister and I and a friend of hers who was a social worker happened to pass by a homeless man on the street in New York City. We were going toward a Starbucks, and we ignored the man on the side of the road and continued on our journey. After we had gotten our cups of coffee, we came out of the shop and walked down the street and ran across, or came to the man that had been lying there, and he was being put into an ambulance on a gurney. My sister asked the ambulance driver what had happened, and he said that this homeless man had been sitting on the side of the street, and someone actually drove by and hit him and broke both of his legs, and he had managed to crawl up onto the side of the curb. My sister turned to me as we walked down the street, silently contemplating this poor man's suffering. And my sister said to me, "We have just reenacted the story of the Good Samaritan. But this time it was a priest and a nurse and a social worker." In our spiritual life, sympathy is a great aid to us in our struggle for sanctity. Sympathy conquers pride, which is the arch enemy of the spiritual life. The sympathetic heart is filled with the living knowledge of Christ crucified. Our sympathy for Jesus is an accurate indicator of our love for Jesus. Mary, may your grace continue to fashion us to have hearts that are open and sympathetic to the sufferings of others.